I sat across from Megan, my wife of 5 years, in a cozy little restaurant downtown. The candlelight flickered softly, casting a warm glow on her face. She looked beautiful, her eyes sparkling as she smiled at me. I couldn't help but feel grateful for her and the life we had built together. As we laughed and reminisced about our journey so far, her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen, her smile faltering for a brief moment. "I'm sorry, John. I need to take this," she said, standing up and heading towards the door. I watched her walk out, feeling a twinge of unease. Megan was gone for almost 20 minutes. I tried to enjoy my meal, but my mind kept drifting back to her. What could be so urgent? When she finally returned, she looked tense. She smiled apologetically and tried to brush it off, but I could tell something was bothering her. The next few weeks were a blur of routine and growing unease. Megan was staying late at the animal shelter more often than usual, always claiming there was too much work to do. She seemed distracted, her mind somewhere else. I began to notice small changes in her behavior. She was more distant, less engaged in our conversations, and always tired. One evening, while she was in the shower, I decided to check her phone. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. To my relief, I didn't find anything suspicious. There were no unusual messages or calls. I told myself I was being paranoid and tried to let it go. But then she started talking about a new colleague at the shelter, Brian. Her eyes lit up whenever she mentioned him. She spoke about how dedicated and passionate he was about the animals and how much they had in common. I tried to be happy for her, but a gnawing doubt took root in my mind. I began to watch her more closely. I noticed how often she brought up Brian in our conversations and how animated she became when talking about him. I decided to speak with one of her colleagues, hoping to ease my worries. What I learned only made things worse. Megan and Brian were spending a lot of time together, even outside of work. One Saturday afternoon, I saw them together at a small cafe. They were sitting close, their heads bent together, sharing a laugh. They looked too comfortable, too intimate. My heart sank. That night I confronted Megan. I told her about my suspicions, about how I felt she was drifting away from me. She denied everything, accusing me of not trusting her. Her words stung, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. Determined to find out the truth, I began to follow her. I watched as she spent more and more time with Brian. They met up after work, went out for drinks, and even had dinner together. One night, while she was out with a friend, I checked her computer. My hands trembled as I navigated through her emails and messages, and there it was, an intimate exchange with Brian. The words on the screen confirmed my worst fears. The next day, I confronted Brian. We met at a coffee shop, and I demanded to know the truth. He admitted everything. They had been having an affair for months. I was devastated. That evening, I confronted Megan again, this time with the evidence in hand. She tried to explain, to justify her actions, but I couldn't listen. The trust was shattered, and I felt nothing but betrayal. I filed for divorce shortly after. The process was painful, but it was necessary. I needed to move on, to start a new chapter in my life. The wounds were deep, but I knew I had to heal. As I navigated my new life, I reflected on our marriage. I learned valuable lessons about trust, communication, and resilience. I vowed to carry these lessons forward and to build relationships based on honesty and understanding. The pain of the past was a heavy burden, but it also became a catalyst for growth and self-discovery. After that unsettling anniversary dinner, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. Megan seemed distant, distracted, and more withdrawn than usual. She started coming home late from the animal shelter more frequently, claiming that there was an overload of work and not enough staff to handle it. I wanted to believe her, but the growing knot in my stomach told me otherwise. I remember one particular evening vividly. Megan had come home late again, and I was sitting on the couch, flipping through channels aimlessly. When she walked through the door, she looked exhausted, but there was a strange energy about her, a restlessness that didn't match the fatigue in her eyes. I asked her how her day was, and she gave me a quick, vague answer before heading straight to the shower. As I listened to the sound of water running, I couldn't help but wonder if my worries were justified. The next few days followed a similar pattern. Megan would leave early and come back late, often mentioning how Brian, the new colleague at the shelter, was such a great help. She spoke about him with a kind of enthusiasm that made me uneasy. Brian this, Brian that. It seemed like he was becoming a significant part of her life. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself that she was just excited about having a competent coworker who shared her passion for animals. But the unease grew. I began to observe her more closely, noting the small changes in her behavior. She was always on her phone, texting and smiling at the screen. When I asked who she was talking to, she would say it was just shelter work or friends. It seemed innocent enough, but there was a lingering doubt that I couldn't ignore. One day I decided to speak with Lily, a friend and colleague of Megan's at the shelter. I casually brought up Megan and Brian's working relationship, trying to sound as nonchalant as possible. Lily's response was friendly but vague, mentioning how well they got along and how they often stayed late to finish up tasks. The confirmation that they were indeed spending a lot of time together didn't ease my worries. It only made them worse. I started noticing how often Megan mentioned Brian in our conversations. Her eyes would light up, and she would talk about how they handled a difficult case or how they managed to find a home for a stray dog. There was an undeniable spark when she spoke about him, a spark I hadn't seen in her eyes for a while when she looked at me. The breaking point came one Saturday afternoon. I had finished my errands early and decided to surprise Megan at the shelter with lunch. When I arrived, the shelter was quiet, and one of the volunteers mentioned that Megan and Brian had stepped out for a coffee. My heart sank, but I decided to wait for her in a nearby cafe, hoping to catch a glimpse of them together. After a while, I saw them walking towards the cafe. They were laughing, and their body language was far too familiar. They sat down at a table near the window, completely engrossed in each other. I watched as they talked, their heads bent close together, sharing private jokes. They looked comfortable, at ease in a way that made my stomach churn with jealousy and suspicion. That evening, when Megan returned home, I couldn't hold back my doubts any longer. I confronted her, trying to keep my voice steady. "Megan, is there something going on between you and Brian?" Her reaction was swift and defensive. "John, how could you even think that? We're just friends and colleagues. You're being ridiculous." I wanted to believe her, but the hurt and frustration were overwhelming. "It's just, you seem different, distant, and you talk about him all the time." Megan sighed, looking weary. "John, it's just work. Brian is a good friend and a great help at the shelter. There's nothing more to it." Her words stung, but I nodded, deciding to drop the subject for now. The tension between us was palpable, and I knew that pushing further would only lead to more arguments. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and I couldn't ignore it. Determined to find out the truth, I started observing her even more closely. I would check her phone when she wasn't looking, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. She was careful, too careful, and that only fueled my suspicions. I began to follow her discreetly, watching as she spent more and more time with Brian. They would go out for drinks after work, have dinner together, and even meet up on weekends. One night, while Megan was out with a friend, I decided to check her computer. My heart raced as I navigated through her emails and messages. And there it was, an intimate exchange with Brian. Their messages were full of affection and longing, confirming my worst fears. The next day, I confronted Brian. We met at a coffee shop, and I demanded to know the truth. He admitted everything. They had been having an affair for months. I was devastated. That evening, I confronted Megan again, this time with the evidence in hand. She tried to explain, to justify her actions, but I couldn't listen. The trust was shattered, and I felt nothing but betrayal. I filed for divorce shortly after. The process was painful, but it was necessary. I needed to move on, to start a new chapter in my life. The wounds were deep, but I knew I had to heal. As I navigated my new life, I reflected on our marriage. I learned valuable lessons about trust, communication, and resilience. I vowed to carry these lessons forward and to build relationships based on honesty and understanding. The pain of the past was a heavy burden, but it also became a catalyst for growth and self-discovery. The days after my confrontation with Megan were filled with a tense, unspoken silence. We avoided each other in our small apartment, each interaction laden with the weight of my suspicions and her denials. I tried to focus on work, to find solace in the familiar routine, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the growing chasm between us. One evening, after a particularly long day at the office, I came home to find Megan already there. She was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the television. I could see the weariness in her eyes, a stark contrast to the vibrant woman I had married. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the conversation I knew we needed to have. "Megan," I began, my voice steady but strained, "we need to talk." She turned to look at me, her expression a mix of apprehension and resignation. "What is it, John?" I sat down opposite her, feeling the weight of my words before I even spoke them. "I can't keep doing this. The late nights, the distance between us, the constant mentions of Brian. It's tearing me apart. I need to know the truth." Megan's eyes filled with tears and she looked away, unable to meet my gaze. "John, I swear, there's nothing going on between me and Brian. We're just friends. You're imagining things." Her words felt hollow, and the tears seemed more like a defensive mechanism than genuine emotion. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder containing the messages I had found. I placed it on the table between us, my hands trembling slightly. "I found these on your computer," I said quietly. "Explain this." Megan's face paled as she stared at the folder. She slowly opened it, her eyes scanning the printed messages. Her hands shook, and she covered her mouth with one hand as if trying to hold back a sob. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes were filled with a mixture of guilt and desperation. "John, I can explain," she stammered. "It wasn't supposed to happen. Brian and we just got close. It started out innocent, just talking about work and sharing stories. But then it became more. I never wanted to hurt you." Her confession hit me like a punch to the gut. I had suspected it, but hearing her say the words made it all too real. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She wiped away a tear, her shoulders shaking. "A few months. I tried to end it, but I didn't know how. I was afraid of what it would do to us." I felt a surge of anger and betrayal. "And what about us, Megan? What about our marriage? Did that mean nothing to you?" "Of course it did," she cried, her voice breaking. "I love you, John. I never stopped loving you. But I was lonely and Brian was there and I made a mistake. A terrible mistake." I stood up, pacing the room as I tried to process her words. The love we once shared felt tainted, overshadowed by her betrayal. "I don't know if I can forgive you for this," I said, my voice shaking. "You broke my trust, Megan. You broke us." She reached out to me, her eyes pleading. "Please, John, give me a chance to make it right. I'll end things with Brian, I swear. I'll do anything to save our marriage." I stopped and looked at her, feeling torn between my love for her and the pain she had caused. "I don't know if it's possible to fix this," I said honestly. "But I need time to think. I need space." Megan nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand. Just, please, don't give up on us." I left the apartment that night, seeking refuge in a nearby hotel. I needed to clear my head, to figure out what to do next. As I lay on the stiff hotel bed, my mind raced with memories of our life together, the good times and the bad. I knew that whatever decision I made would change our lives forever. The following weeks were a blur of difficult conversations and painful realizations. Megan and I attended a few counseling sessions, trying to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. But the wound was too deep, the betrayal too raw. No matter how hard we tried, the ghost of her affair lingered between us, a constant reminder of what had been lost. Eventually, I made the painful decision to file for divorce. It was not a decision I made lightly, but it was the only way I could see to move forward. Megan was devastated, but she understood. We parted ways with a heavy heart, each of us carrying the weight of our mistakes. Starting over was difficult. The apartment felt empty without Megan, and the routines we had shared were now hollow echoes of a life that no longer existed. But slowly, I began to heal. I focused on my work, spent time with friends, and started to rediscover who I was outside of my marriage. One day, as I was packing up some old boxes, I found a photo album from our wedding. I flipped through the pages, remembering the joy and love we had felt that day. It was a bittersweet reminder of what we had once had and what we had lost. In the end, I realized that the pain of betrayal had taught me valuable lessons about trust, communication, and resilience. I vowed to carry these lessons forward and to build relationships based on honesty and understanding. The past was a heavy burden, but it also became a catalyst for growth and self-discovery. As I stood at the crossroads of my new life, I knew that I had the strength to move on. The road ahead was uncertain, but I was ready to face it, one step at a time. The weeks that followed our separation were marked by an overwhelming sense of loneliness and a desperate need for answers. I had moved into a small apartment downtown, attempting to build a new life from the fragments of my broken marriage. Despite the pain, I found solace in the familiar routines of work and the occasional outings with friends. Yet, a part of me remained fixated on understanding the full extent of Megan's betrayal. One Saturday morning, driven by a mix of curiosity and unresolved anger, I decided to visit the animal shelter where Megan and Brian worked. I needed to see for myself the place where their affair had blossomed, to confront the reality that had shattered my world. I rationalized it as a quest for closure, a way to understand the context that had led to the dissolution of our marriage. The shelter was a modest building on the outskirts of town, surrounded by a large fenced-in yard where dogs of all sizes played. As I walked through the front door, the smell of animals and disinfectant filled the air. The receptionist greeted me with a polite smile, unaware of the turmoil churning inside me. "I'm here to see Megan," I said, my voice steady despite the nervous tension gripping my stomach. The receptionist nodded and pointed down the hall. "She's in the back, working with the cats today." I made my way down the narrow corridor, my footsteps echoing in the quiet space. As I approached the cat room, I heard the familiar sound of Megan's voice, soft and soothing as she spoke to the animals. I paused outside the door, gathering my thoughts before stepping inside. Megan looked up as I entered, her expression shifting from surprise to wary curiosity. "John, what are you doing here?" "I needed to see you," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral, "and to see this place." She nodded slowly, glancing around the room filled with cats in various stages of relaxation and play. "This is where I spend most of my time now. It's peaceful here." I looked around, taking in the clean, organized space. "It looks nice," I said, struggling to find the right words. "I wanted to understand what happened, Megan, to see for myself." She sighed, setting down the kitten she had been holding. "I don't know if seeing this place will give you the answers you're looking for, but I understand why you came." Before I could respond, the door opened and Brian walked in. He froze when he saw me, his expression a mix of guilt and apprehension. "John," he said, his voice tense, "I didn't expect to see you here." I turned to face him, feeling a surge of anger and resentment. "Brian," I replied curtly, "I came to understand how this happened, how my marriage fell apart because of you." Brian swallowed hard, glancing at Megan before speaking. "I never meant to hurt you, John. What happened between Megan and me, it wasn't planned. It just happened." "That's not an excuse," I snapped, unable to contain my frustration. "You both betrayed me. I trusted you, Megan, and you, Brian. You knew she was married." Megan stepped forward, her eyes pleading. "John, please. I know we made a terrible mistake, but we're trying to make things right here at the shelter, to help these animals. It doesn't excuse what we did, but it's something." I looked at her, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. Despite everything, I knew she genuinely cared about her work and the animals. "I'm not here to cause trouble," I said, my voice softening. "I just needed to see this place, to understand." Brian nodded, his expression somber. "I get it, John, and I'm truly sorry for what happened. If I could go back and change things, I would." There was a long, uncomfortable silence as we stood there, the weight of our shared history hanging heavily in the air. Finally, I turned to Megan. "I hope you find what you're looking for here. I hope you can make things right." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Thank you, John. I hope you find peace too." I left the shelter feeling a strange mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and a glimmer of closure. Seeing Megan and Brian in their element, dedicated to their work, didn't erase the pain they had caused, but it gave me a sense of understanding. Their affair had been a mistake, a tragic misstep in their otherwise meaningful lives. As I walked back to my car, I realized that closure wasn't about forgetting the past or erasing the hurt. It was about accepting what had happened and finding a way to move forward. Megan and Brian had their path, and I had mine. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time since the betrayal, I felt a sense of direction. I drove home with a clearer mind, ready to face the challenges of rebuilding my life. There would be more difficult days ahead, but I knew that I had the strength to overcome them. The encounter at the shelter had given me the closure I needed, and with it, the courage to embrace the future. After my visit to the shelter, life continued in its new, uncomfortable normalcy. The brief closure I had found there provided some relief, but the wounds were still fresh, and the path to healing was long. As I navigated through my days, I found solace in familiar routines and the support of friends. Yet despite my best efforts, Megan's betrayal lingered in my thoughts, a constant reminder of my broken trust. One evening, while sitting alone in my apartment, I received an unexpected call from Megan. Her name flashing on my phone screen stirred a mix of emotions, curiosity, apprehension, and a faint trace of the love I had once felt for her. "Hello, Megan," I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. "John, hi," she replied, her voice sounding unusually hesitant. I was wondering if we could talk. There's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you a long time ago." Her words piqued my curiosity and deepened my unease. "Okay, where do you want to meet?" "Can we meet at the park near our old apartment?" she asked. "It seems like a fitting place." "Sure," I agreed, despite the knot forming in my stomach. "I'll be there in 30 minutes. The drive to the park felt surreal. As I parked my car and walked toward our designated meeting spot, memories of our time together flooded my mind. The park had been a place of many happy moments, picnics, long walks, and shared dreams. Seeing it now, through the lens of our fractured relationship, felt bittersweet. Megan was already there, sitting on a bench under a large oak tree. She looked up as I approached, her face reflecting a mixture of sadness and determination. "Thank you for meeting me," she said as I sat down beside her. "Of course," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. "What is it you need to tell me?" She took a deep breath, looking down at her hands. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since we separated. About us, about what happened. And I realized there's something you need to know. Something I've been hiding." My heart pounded in my chest, the weight of her words pressing down on me. "What is it, Megan?" She looked up, her eyes filled with regret. "John, before Brian, there was someone else. His name was Michael. We met at a conference last year. It started with innocent conversations and escalated to something more. It lasted a few months, but I ended it before you ever found out." I stared at her, the revelation hitting me like a sledgehammer. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you deserve the truth," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I thought I could keep it hidden, but it has been eating me up inside. I betrayed you not once, but twice, and you deserve to know the whole truth before we move on with our lives." Anger and betrayal surged within me, mixing with a deep sense of disappointment. "So all this time you've been lying to me. You made me think it was just Brian, but it was more than that." Megan nodded, her shoulders shaking with sobs. "I'm so sorry, John. I was weak, and I made terrible mistakes. I never wanted to hurt you, but I did, over and over again." I stood up, needing to distance myself from the painful confession. "I don't know what to say, Megan. I thought I had come to terms with your affair with Brian, but this changes everything." She stood as well, reaching out to me. "John, please, I know I've destroyed any trust you had in me, but I needed you to know the truth. I want to find a way to make amends, even if it means losing you forever." I looked at her, feeling a mix of anger, sadness, and a strange sense of relief. The truth, however painful, was finally out in the open. "Megan, I appreciate your honesty, but I need time to process this. I can't just forgive and forget. There's too much hurt, too much betrayal." She nodded, tears still streaming down her face. "I understand. Take all the time you need. I just hope that one day you'll find it in your heart to forgive me, even if we can't be together." Without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving Megan standing alone under the oak tree. The weight of her confession pressed heavily on my mind as I made my way back to my car. I knew that this new revelation would make the journey to healing even more challenging, but it was a necessary step toward finding closure. As I drove home, I reflected on the lessons I had learned. Trust, once broken, is incredibly difficult to rebuild. But honesty, even when it comes too late, can be a powerful catalyst for change. I didn't know what the future held, but I was determined to face it with a clearer understanding of my past and a renewed sense of purpose. The days following Megan's confession were some of the hardest I had ever faced. The additional betrayal felt like a fresh wound on top of the old ones. Despite the intense pain, I knew I had to move forward and start the process of divorce. It was the only way I could reclaim my life and begin to heal. The first step was finding a lawyer. I reached out to my friend Mark, who had gone through a divorce a few years back. He recommended a reputable attorney named Laura Jenkins, who had a reputation for being both empathetic and efficient. After a brief phone call, I scheduled an appointment to meet her in person. Laura's office was in a sleek, modern building downtown. As I walked into the reception area, I felt a wave of anxiety wash over me. The reality of ending my marriage was becoming more tangible, and it was both terrifying and necessary. "Mr. Anderson, Laura will see you now," the receptionist said, offering me a warm smile. I nodded and followed her down a hallway lined with framed degrees and certificates. Laura's office was spacious, with large windows that let in plenty of natural light. She stood up as I entered, extending her hand. "John, it's nice to meet you. Please have a seat," she said, her tone professional yet compassionate. "Thank you, Laura," I replied, shaking her hand and sitting down. "I appreciate you seeing me on such short notice." "Of course. Divorce is never easy, and it's important to get started on the right foot. Why don't you tell me a bit about your situation?" I took a deep breath and began recounting the events of the past few months. The affair with Brian, Megan's confession about Michael, and the decision to separate. Laura listened intently, nodding occasionally and jotting down notes. "Based on what you've told me, it sounds like you have grounds for divorce due to adultery," she said once I had finished. "We can file on those grounds, but it's also possible to file on the basis of irreconcilable differences, which is often less contentious. How do you want to proceed?" "I think irreconcilable differences might be the best option," I replied. "I don't want this to turn into a battle. I just want to move on." Laura nodded. "That's a wise choice. We'll need to discuss the division of assets, any shared debts, and whether there are any other considerations, such as alimony." "Do you and Megan have any children?" "No, we don't," I said, feeling a small sense of relief. At least we didn't have to navigate the complexities of child custody. "That simplifies things somewhat," Laura said, making another note. "I'll draft the necessary paperwork and file the petition for divorce. Once Megan is served, she'll have the opportunity to respond. If she agrees to the terms, we can move forward relatively quickly. If not, we may need to negotiate or mediate." The days that followed were a blur of paperwork and difficult conversations. I had to gather financial documents, list our shared assets, and outline our debts. It was a stark reminder of the life we had built together and how it was now being systematically dismantled. Megan and I met a few times to discuss the details. Our interactions were civil but strained, each meeting a painful reminder of what we had lost. We agreed on the division of our assets without much contention. We would sell our apartment and split the proceeds, and each of us would keep our respective retirement accounts and personal belongings. One of the hardest parts was deciding what to do with our shared possessions. As we went through our apartment, sorting through furniture, kitchenware, and mementos from our life together, it felt like we were dismantling not just our home, but our shared history. "I'll take the couch and the dining table," Megan said during one of our meetings. "You can have the bed and the coffee table." "Okay," I agreed, trying to keep my voice steady. "What about the photos and albums?" Megan looked at the collection of pictures from vacations, family gatherings, and moments of joy. "Let's each take half. We can digitize the rest." As we divided our lives into boxes and bags, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of sorrow. It was the end of an era, and no matter how amicable we tried to be, the underlying pain was undeniable. Once the paperwork was finalized and signed, Laura filed the petition for divorce. Megan was served, and she responded promptly, agreeing to the terms. The court date was set, and we both prepared for the final step in our marriage's dissolution. On the day of the hearing, I dressed in a suit and tie, feeling a mix of anxiety and resignation. The courthouse was a solemn place, filled with people navigating their own legal battles. Megan arrived shortly after me, looking equally somber. We sat in the courtroom listening as the judge reviewed our case. When it was our turn, Laura presented our agreement to the judge. Megan's lawyer did the same. The judge asked a few questions to ensure that we both understood and agreed to the terms. "Mr. and Mrs. Anderson," the judge said, looking at us with a kind but firm expression, Based on the evidence and your mutual agreement, I hereby grant your divorce. I wish you both the best as you move forward with your lives." The finality of the judge's words hit me like a tidal wave. Megan and I exchanged a brief, bittersweet glance before we both nodded in acknowledgement. It was over. Outside the courthouse, we stood in awkward silence. The weight of the moment hung heavily between us. "Take care, Megan," I said finally, my voice filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. "You too, John," she replied, tears welling up in her eyes. "I hope you find happiness." With that, we parted ways, each of us stepping into our new, separate lives. The process of divorce had been grueling, but it was a necessary step towards healing. As I walked away from the courthouse, I felt a strange sense of relief mingled with the pain. It was time to move forward, to rebuild, and to find a way to live again. The weeks following the finalization of the divorce were a tumultuous mix of grief, relief, and a tentative sense of newfound freedom. I had moved into a smaller apartment on the other side of town, a place that felt empty yet full of potential. The echoes of my past life still haunted me, but I was determined to rebuild and find a new path. Work became my refuge. The steady routine and familiar tasks helped ground me, giving me a sense of purpose. My colleagues, aware of my recent turmoil, offered their support in subtle ways. An encouraging word, a shared lunch, a sympathetic ear. It wasn't much, but it helped. One evening, as I was sifting through old photos on my computer, I stumbled upon an album from our trip to Yosemite. The images of towering cliffs, pristine lakes, and winding trails brought back a flood of memories. Despite the pain, I found comfort in the beauty of those moments, reminding me that life could still hold joy and adventure. Inspired by this, I decided to take a solo trip to the mountains. I needed to reconnect with myself, to find solace in nature's embrace. I packed my hiking gear, booked a cabin, and set out early one Saturday morning. The drive to the mountains was long and winding, but the scenery was breathtaking. As I ascended the forested roads, the air grew cooler and the noise of the city faded into a distant memory. When I finally arrived at the cabin, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for months. The cabin was small but cozy, nestled among tall pines and overlooking a serene lake. I unpacked my belongings and set out for a hike, eager to explore the trails. The sound of birdsong and the rustling of leaves accompanied me as I walked, each step a cathartic release of the stress and sorrow I had been carrying. As I hiked, I reflected on my journey so far. The betrayal, the divorce, and the process of rebuilding had tested me in ways I had never imagined. But I also realized that these experiences had taught me valuable lessons about resilience, self-worth, and the importance of honesty. On the third day of my trip, I reached the summit of a particularly challenging trail. The view from the top was spectacular, endless miles of verdant forest, distant mountain peaks, and a clear blue sky. As I stood there, taking in the beauty of the world around me, I felt a profound sense of liberation. This was my life, my journey, and I had the power to shape it. When I returned home, I was filled with a renewed sense of purpose. I began to take steps to build a life that was truly my own. I joined a local hiking club, reconnecting with my love for the outdoors, and meeting new people who shared my interests. I signed up for a photography class, eager to capture the beauty of the world through a new lens. One evening, while attending a gallery opening hosted by my photography class, I struck up a conversation with a woman named Laura. She was an artist, her work vibrant and full of emotion. We talked about our passions, our journeys, and the ways in which art and nature had helped us heal. There was an instant connection, a spark of something new and exciting. As the weeks turned into months, Laura and I grew closer. Our shared love for creativity and the outdoors brought us together, and our conversations were filled with laughter, understanding, and genuine connection. She became a source of joy in my life, helping me see that there was still room for happiness and love. Throughout this time, Megan and I maintained a distant but cordial relationship. We occasionally exchanged emails or messages, updating each other on our lives. There was no animosity, just a mutual understanding that we had both moved on. One day I received a message from Megan. She had started a new job at an animal rescue organization in another state, a place where she could continue her work and find a fresh start. She wished me well and expressed hope that we both could find peace and happiness in our new lives. Reading her message, I felt a sense of closure. The pain of our past had finally started to fade, replaced by a quiet acceptance and hope for the future. As I sat in my apartment, looking at the photos from my recent hikes and thinking about the new relationships I had formed, I realized that I had come a long way. The process of rebuilding was ongoing, but I was no longer defined by my past. I was stronger, more resilient, and ready to embrace whatever the future held. Life had taught me that even in the face of betrayal and heartache, there was always a path forward. It might be rocky and uncertain, but with each step, I was carving out a new chapter, one filled with growth, discovery, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. As the seasons changed, so did the landscape of my life. The pain and confusion of the past gradually gave way to a sense of peace and clarity. I had found new passions, built new friendships, and rekindled a sense of purpose. My journey of healing was far from over, but I could finally see the light at the end of the tunnel. Laura had become an integral part of my life. Our bond deepened with each passing day, and her presence brought a joy I had long forgotten. We spent weekends hiking, exploring new trails, and capturing the beauty of nature through our cameras. Her artistic eye inspired me, and together we created a collection of photographs that told the story of our shared adventures. One crisp autumn afternoon, as we sat by the lake near my cabin, Laura turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "John, have you ever thought about what comes next? Beyond healing and rebuilding, what do you want for your future?" Her question took me by surprise, but as I pondered it, I realized I had indeed been thinking about the future, albeit cautiously. "I want to keep growing," I said. "I want to continue exploring, learning, and building a life that feels true to who I am. And," I added, taking her hand in mine, "I want you to be a part of it." Laura smiled, her eyes shining with warmth. "I'd like that very much. I believe we have a lot of wonderful adventures ahead of us." As the days grew shorter and the air turned colder, I decided it was time to take a significant step. I invited Laura to move in with me. We had grown inseparable, and the idea of sharing a home felt like the natural progression of our relationship. She accepted with enthusiasm, and we spent the following weeks merging our lives, combining our belongings, decorating our space, and creating new routines together. One evening, as we sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets and watching the sunset, Laura turned to me with a contemplative look. "John, have you ever considered making a career out of your photography? Your work is incredible, and I think it could touch a lot of people." Her suggestion planted a seed in my mind. Photography had become more than just a hobby. It was a way to express myself and find beauty in the world. With Laura's encouragement, I started building a portfolio and reached out to local galleries and online platforms to showcase my work. The response was overwhelmingly positive, and I soon found myself with opportunities to exhibit my photos and even sell some pieces. The success of my photography career was a testament to the power of transformation. It reminded me that even from the depths of pain, something beautiful could emerge. I had turned my passion into a purpose, and it filled me with a sense of fulfillment I hadn't felt in years. Months passed, and my relationship with Laura continued to flourish. We supported each other's dreams, celebrated each other's successes, and navigated life's challenges as a team. Our love was built on a foundation of trust, honesty, and shared experiences, and it felt stronger than anything I had known before. One spring morning, as we hiked up a familiar trail to our favorite lookout point, I felt a surge of emotion. The view from the top was breathtaking, and as we stood there, hand in hand, I realized how far I'd come. The journey had been arduous, but it had led me to a place of happiness and contentment. "Laura," I said, turning to face her, "this spot means a lot to me. It's where I found peace and where I started to rebuild my life. And now, I want it to be where we take the next step in our journey together." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small box, opening it to reveal a ring. Laura's eyes widened in surprise and delight. "Will you marry me?" I asked, my heart pounding with anticipation. Tears welled up in her eyes as she nodded. "Yes, John, I will." We embraced, the world around us fading as we held each other close. It was a moment of pure joy, a new beginning that symbolized the culmination of my journey from heartbreak to healing. Our wedding was a simple, intimate affair, surrounded by close friends and family. Megan, true to her word, sent her best wishes from afar, and I felt a sense of closure and gratitude for the paths our lives had taken. Laura and I exchanged vows under the same oak tree where I had once confronted the painful truths of my past. This time, however, it was a place of love and hope. As we celebrated our union, I reflected on the incredible journey that had brought me to this point. Life had tested me, but it had also given me the strength to rise above the challenges. I had learned that even in the face of betrayal and loss, there was always a path forward, one filled with new opportunities, love, and the promise of a brighter future. With Laura by my side, I was ready to embrace whatever came next. Our story was just beginning, and together, we would continue to explore, create, and find joy in the simple moments. The past had shaped me, but it no longer defined me. I was free to build a new life, one filled with love, adventure, and the endless possibilities of a new beginning.